Hello everyone, my name is Tax and welcome back to the Lovecraftian Video Game Retrospective, and welcome to At the Mountains of Madness, a 2016 first-person adventure game, and not to be confused with Mystery Stories Mountains of Madness, both of which are based on the Lovecraft story of the same name, but Mystery Stories is a hidden object game rather than a pure adventure game. At the Mountains of Madness depicts you as an archaeologist in an expedition to Antarctica to uncover some ancient ruins and old artifacts. It's a first-person adventure, as already mentioned, and you do the usual stuff. You talk to people, you pick up items, you interact with objects, you solve some simple puzzles, you do some searching, and you find some clues, stuff like this. Overall, the game is not that dramatically different from other first-person adventure games, but unfortunately it does have a lot of issues. And the issue starts with the options menu. The game's options menu doesn't really seem to work properly. All the settings start out at the maximum, which is unfortunate because the game is actually quite demanding. So there's a good chance that it will not perform optimally on your machine. And oftentimes you just can't turn down the settings. I was unable to change the game's resolution and turn down some of the settings to increase performance oftentimes. And even when I was able to do so, the options wouldn't always stick when I closed the game and came back later, and that's unfortunate. There's also an issue with the save menu. There are only so many save slots, and that wouldn't be an issue if the game worked properly, but unfortunately there's quite a number of dead ends. So you are encouraged to not overwrite saves and reload from older saves a couple of times, but unfortunately with a limited number of saves, that's something that's a little bit more difficult than it should be. And to be honest, there should just be an unlimited number of saves, or at least a very high number. At the moment you can have something like 10 save slots, there should just be something like 50 or 100. Then there's also the voice acting. The voice acting is not great, it's not the worst, but it sounds very much like developer voice acting. And to be honest, it would probably be best if there wasn't any voice acting at all. And the voice acting also goes along with text that's not completely free of grammatical and orthographical errors, so that doesn't help to improve the game's story either. Regarding the story is quite simple. You fly towards the ruins, some events happen, you explore the ruins, the end. That's pretty much it. It sounds very simplistic, but there's a lot of stuff in the background, but it's only hinted at, and it's not very well explained. And I don't mean that in a mysterious way, it's not well explained in a way that gives you the feeling there's very little reason to care about it. And your character knows a lot of stuff that you don't know, and at the same time you have the feeling that you have a lot of information that your character has, and your character is acting up on information he doesn't really have. For example, during a large part of the game your objective is to follow the elder things. Unfortunately, that's not really clear because you don't really see them when you're supposed to follow them, so why is the main character following the elder things when he hasn't really mentioned them before? And he hasn't really seen them, so we aren't really aware that he even knows what elder things are. Now with regard to the graphics, the game doesn't look terrible, but unfortunately it performs quite badly. There's a lot of motion blur, which makes the game a strain on the eye, and it's also a little bit too taxing on your system. And the performance is generally quite poor. I have quite a powerful machine that can run more sophisticated games than this on quite high settings, but unfortunately At the Mountains of Madness performed quite poorly. That was improved a lot with recent patches, but it still doesn't perform great, and it still lacks the option of actually properly turning down all the menu options for graphics settings. So even if your machine could handle medium to high settings with this game, there's a good chance that you're just unable to set the game to that actually, due to the aforementioned bug with the graphics options. Occasionally textures look also really pixelated, almost like they were ripped from a DOS game. I'm not quite sure why, because other times you see the same texture or a very similar one and it looks perfectly fine, so I'm not quite sure what the issue there is. The game also recycles a lot of assets, which wouldn't be a problem, because you can't really expect to be every single area to be completely unique and individual, unless the game is very short or covers a very small area. But the problem here is that the game is actually quite large, but a lot of these areas are just empty, and you just walk through them or you explore them and there's actually nothing to see. And if you spend that much time just walking around doing almost nothing, then those recycled assets become quite obvious, and the game should either have more variety and more eye candy, or should simply cover a smaller area that's not completely empty. There's also a good chance that you will get stuck somewhere in the game, either just in the landscape, occasionally you just walk and you get stuck, occasionally you get trapped behind an invisible wall, occasionally you also walk through a wall that shouldn't be a wall you could walk through, but you still do it, and then you land in an area which you can't leave. You can also jump down a cliff and occasionally you can't leave, or fall into a cleft. There's a lot of these areas. It's not like you stumble in them all the time, but it does happen often enough that I do recommend you think twice where you actually save and don't overwrite save games and back up your save games, because there's also a bug that may delete all your save games. I'm not quite sure whether it's still in the game, but I did have some issues with that earlier on, so be aware of that. There's also an issue with the equipment. Firstly, the equipment is way too rare. There's a freezing mechanic in the game, but we'll get back to that later, and it requires you to have quite large amount of supplies with you if you want to finish the game in a decent amount of time. But unfortunately, your equipment occasionally disappears when you reload a save, and generally spoken, there's just too little of it. But at the same time, when you reload the games, enemies and equipment respawn, so you can actually farm equipment, which I deem almost essential to actually complete the game in a manageable way. Unfortunately, respawning enemies means that you can actually respawn within an enemy, and there's a good chance that's going to happen because a lot of enemies, namely the albino penguins, hang around warm crystals that give you back some warmth. I'll get back to that later. So there's a good chance that you will actually save around those crystals. Unfortunately, when the penguins respawn when you reload, there's a good chance that you will actually respawn right next to them or even inside them, and then they will probably kill you straight away, because the penguins are usually not that much of a threat, because you do have a shotgun in the game. There are some minor first-person shooter elements, but once they're on top of you, they kill you with 2 or 3 attacks, so this is definitely an issue. There's also an issue with the levels being too huge and empty. I've already mentioned that. There's a lot of areas where we just wander through and there's nothing to do, and you spend a good portion of the time just essentially wasting time because there's nothing to do, and the game just doesn't look good enough or interesting enough to warrant wandering through snowy ruins for an hour. Your character also walks way too slow, which ties in with the same problem, and you do have the option to run, but obviously you have a stamina meter which runs out very quickly. And this also leads me to the freezing mechanic. The game does have a freezing mechanic. Your character loses body heat all the time, even in areas where your character clearly shouldn't use body heat. But yeah, that's neither here nor there. So, and if you lose all your warmth, your character doesn't die, which is what I did expect to happen. No, instead, you simply walk even slower, which is completely agonizing. There's also a freezing effect on the screen. So not only does the character walk slower, but you can also not see properly anymore, which just makes the game an absolute pain to play, and this mechanic should be completely reworked in my opinion, or better just completely removed, because it doesn't really add a whole lot. This game isn't a real survival game, so just scrap this mechanic. You can regain warmth by going to crystals, making a fire, or by eating hand-baked beans, which also refills your health bar. And while it does eating the beans recovers about maybe 60% of your health, they're actually not that common in the game. So what I had to do to complete the game properly was to farm the beans by saving, collecting the beans, reloading, collecting the beans again, because there's actually a couple of sections where you need to run fast, and if you don't have any beans left or any firewood by that time, then you are essentially stuck forever, unless you can reload an earlier save game, which again brings me back to not overriding save games, and there should be more save stats in general. The game's playtime is actually quite short. You can complete the game in something like 2 or 3 hours. I did a let's play of the game and it took me about 3.5 to 4 hours to complete the game, but that did include just walking around through ruins aimlessly, partially because at one point the game was in a state where it wasn't patched enough to actually be completable, which is another sin, especially if your game isn't actually in early access. But that has been patched out at this point. But nevertheless, there's a good chance that you spend a lot of time just wandering around, which I wouldn't count as actual game time, because that's not really what you should do. And if there's nothing to interact with, nothing to hear, no clues to listen to, then that's not really excusable. And the total game time I spent with this game is actually 12 or 13 hours, which gives you an indicator how much time I did spend just wandering around. Keep in mind though that I did spend some time being stuck without knowing it, because the game hadn't been patched sufficiently though, so at this point you will be able to complete the game faster. There are also a couple of broken triggers and scripts. Occasionally you have an objective that you shouldn't have anymore, or you just can't continue. I've mentioned that already. This has largely been fixed, but there's still some issues with triggers. Occasionally you have to reload, or your character is teleported to a new area and you're stuck and you have to reload, and then your character can walk freely. Minor things, but still more annoyances and more issues that shouldn't be in the game in the first place. With regard to difficulty, the game isn't actually all that hard, and almost all of the difficulty is derived from you fighting bugs, glitches, or struggling to find anywhere to go. And that's not really what should make a game difficult. That doesn't really make it challenging and rewarding, it makes it more annoying. With regard to the Lovecraftian elements, there are a couple of them in the game. Obviously this game is based on the Lovecraftian story of the same name. Unfortunately they almost get pushed into the background. Your character just walks the ruins. There are some cutscenes in between that do give you more of an idea, but they feel very disconnected from the actual game, and you have the feeling you never really interact with anything that's Lovecraftian. You just find the ruins, you walk through the ruins, the end, and everything that happens that's actually related to Lovecraftian stories feels a little bit tacked on, to be honest. So I can't really recommend this game for its Lovecraftian elements, and I can't really recommend it as an adventure game, unfortunately. Which is a shame, because I think this game, despite all its bugs and glitches, did have some potential, but unfortunately it's just not good enough to be a recommendation from my side. So thanks for watching, and I shall see you next time. Take care and goodbye.